economist from Wits University. Dr. Creamer, thank you so much for your time and for joining us here on Newsnight on ENCA. Could you share with us your reflections on the passing of Tito Mboweni?
Yes, well, good evening. I think it's really fitting that we remember his contribution. Very few people have done as much as he did over the years in helping to shape the South African economy, and he played many pivotal roles as a cabinet minister, as a Reserve Bank governor, sat on many boards, and even before that, in the 1980s, as a young student in exile, he studied economics, and he started to influence the thinking of the ANC economic policy, was involved with others in drafting the Reconstruction and Development Program, the ANC's Ready to Govern document. So he had a really long history, very influential, and as I say, there's very few people who played such a pivotal role in the shaping of this country's economy.
It's perhaps a stereotype, but many people say those who work with finances or complex economic concepts are a certain type of people, and they're not necessarily always that in touch with their softer side or with their with the people, but yet that does not seem to strike me as true in the case of former Minister Tito Mboweni, someone who was very charismatic, who had a strong connection with South Africans from all walks of life.
You're right. I think reflecting on it now, he always had a kind of softer side. He had a good sense of humor. Always had something to say to you, a couple of jokes, a couple of comments. And but at the same time, when the chips were down and serious decisions had to be made, he had the confidence, I think linked to his economic training, to be able to lay out the options and to show his comrades the trade-offs that had to be made, saying, well, if we do this, this is the consequence. If you want to do this, then we have to do less of that. And I saw him in operation in that sense as well. So he could be very firm and he could be very clear, as much as he had his charming side.
So it's also interesting to note that Tito Mboweni was Minister of Labour shortly after 1994, if I am correct. And then, in contrast to that, Minister of Finance later in his career, having to work with both Labour and formulate economic policy alongside the private sector, where you also mentioned earlier he was very involved, sitting on the boards of many companies, and perhaps the insights from both sides of that coin allowed him to be very pragmatic.
Yes, let's reflect on that. I think you're pointing to an interesting reality. He was the Minister of Labour as a very young man, in his 30s, in Nelson Mandela's cabinet, and then in about 2018, as an older man, probably in his 60s just about, he would have been called back by President Ramaphosa to serve as the Minister of Finance. So in the first guise as the Minister of Labour, he was extremely influential. That was the period when the Basic Conditions of Employment Act was passed, the Labour Relations Act, the CCMA was brought into being. Also the NEDLAC, there had been a process of saying that the Labour government and business should work together in formulating economic policy, whether it was the labour laws, whether it was the Competition Act at that time. As your previous speaker said, there were disagreements on macroeconomic policy, but there were areas where NEDLAC, so he forged NEDLAC and that process, so very effective. Then he went to the Reserve Bank and was an excellent governor of the Reserve Bank, introducing and implementing the inflation targeting framework. As Minister of Finance, he was called back, I think, as an elder statesman almost, with his track record and experience, needing to set the ship of state right after the state capture period, where there'd been so much corruption, looting, mismanagement of finances, and we needed an honest politician who understood the economy to bring stability to our public finances. Yet, if you were listening to the President's speech earlier today, he reflected on the fact that much of the work of the GNU around reform of the rail, electricity, telecommunication sectors was down to some of the work that Minister Tito Mboweni did as Minister of Finance when he started what became Operation Vulindlela. And there's a large consensus around the work of Vulindlela to improve the competitiveness of the South African economy through structural reform. So his fingerprints are all over so many various aspects of our economic life.
Thank you so much for sharing your reflections with us on the passing of former Minister Tito Mboweni. We're going to continue the conversation